Welcome back to the Chris Spangle Show. Thanks so much for joining me here on the program, and we are continuing our conversations with Leslie Corbly about big picture ideas, worldviews. What are the foundations? Like, what's the climate that creates the weather of politics, right? As opposed to just the weather of who's up, who's down in the horse race of politics. Let's talk about your beliefs. What do you believe, and how do you get to what you believe? And, Leslie, do you like my Glenn Beck music? This is like classic Glenn Beck music theme. I think that's
you're
kind
right.
of...
I hadn't even made that connection, but you're right.
The first,
it does sound like...
second or third time, I was like, this sounds like an old school Glenn Beck intro. I like it. Now he's got like some weird thing. It's like, if you're going to survive, you're like, it's not that deep, bro. We gotta band together like an army, and we're all gonna fall. And you're like, this is really apocalyptic. I don't know. I don't know if you were a Glenn Beck fan, but like I started running the board for his radio show back in 2005. You're probably like a 5-year-old, but you were already reading like Plato. And I just like, this is the guy. And now he's like, they're creating the hurricane and steering it towards me. Like, okay, dude.
My mom listened to him when I was in high school, I want to say, because she would listen to some talk radio, and my parents watched Fox News. But I didn't really follow him much. I've read some of what, listened to some of his interviews, read some of his articles, some of the things he's written.
Yeah.
And he's just an interesting character to me. Like, he's someone that I feel like if I were born 30 years from now or 40 years from now, I want to read a biography of Glenn Beck.
Oh, dude,
he's a fascinating character.
As a person who's worked in radio, for 20 of my professional years, 15 of that has been in radio. Glenn Beck is, he's like on the Mount Rushmore. I think in just terms of technical skill and what he's been able and how far he's been able to take it. He's just, I actually have met him. I met him a couple times back when I worked at the radio station. He was just super nice. Obviously, it's like you meet him at a book signing. Of course he's going to be nice. Yeah. He's not going to be like, what's your name, Fatso?
What? Well, what was it back in? I think it was back in sometime in mid 2015. I don't remember the exact year, but I thought I listened to a really interesting conversation he had where he gave a bunch of reasons that he thought that he was going down the wrong path at Fox News. Like, he made sort of a public apology that I thought was really interesting from someone of his caliber of talent and someone who makes so many public statements, right? He's been in the public eye for so long. Anyway, again, he's not someone I followed in depth by any stretch of the imagination, but he's a fascinating character and has such a different persona than, say, someone like Rush Limbaugh.
Yeah.
Unapologetically
never going to admit they're wrong. Unapologetically, the way that they are. There's definitely, I think, and that to me is, Rush Limbaugh never really talked about faith. Maybe he did somewhere and he was a Christian, but like he is definitely, I think this is a great conversation to lean into the Republican Party, because Rush Limbaugh is kind of the precursor of the Trump Republican Party. Like, wealth, the gold in the IB microphone, playing golf while smoking your cigar with your high-end tie. Like, he's just, Rush Limbaugh was amazing at as a talented radio person, no matter what you think of his politics. I think he was destructive in terms of political discourse and public policy and had his faults, and you could probably say Glenn is too. But when you hear Donald Trump talk, what I hear is every person I phone screened in 2004 to 2008. Like, every person that called into the radio station talked like Donald Trump, thought like Donald Trump, because they had been listening to Rush Limbaugh for so long. And I just finished this great book. I think it's let me look at my Goodreads to get the title, because it was a very fair, not biased look at the history of talk radio, which really has only existed since the early 90s. Mm-hmm. And I think everybody who wants to understand the modern Republican Party should read this book, because it gives you like the arc of Rush Limbaugh and talk radio and how much it shaped the Republican Party. It's called by Brian Rosenwald, Talk Radio's America. It's a great audiobook, great Kindle book. It's available everywhere. But Rush Limbaugh There's a Ross Douthat tweet says, if you didn't like the Christian right, wait until you meet the non-Christian right, or the unchristian right, I think is maybe the term. And so Glenn Beck to me kind of represents that 2000s steeped in religion, Judeo-Christian worldview. We're bringing religion to politics. Mike Pence, I think, is somebody who would kind of typify that vein. George Bush. Yeah. And then Rush Limbaugh is more of it's not as much about the ideology, it's about the win. It's about success. It's about not necessarily principles. We're always going to talk about principles, but our principles are kind of floating. I mean, so to me, there was a big rivalry. There's actually a funny movie on talk radio on HBO that's I forget who. I don't even know what it's called. It's not worth watching, but it's basically like the Glenn Beck versus the Rush Limbaugh character, and that to me is kind of where the right has been for the last 10 years. Are you going to go with, Ted Cruz or Donald Trump? And they chose Donald Trump, and now all the Ted Cruzes and Mike Lees and Tea Party people are Donald Trump. I think it's been really fascinating to watch, Leslie.
It has, and I'm actually curious your perspective on this, because I have my views on Trump are like so muddled right now. Because like just because of everything that's happened in the past, gosh, I mean, I hate to say it, but what is it? It's almost like been a decade since,
it's been a decade. Yeah. I mean, he came down that elevator in 2015. Yeah.
That's unreal to me. So my views on this have definitely morphed over time. Maybe that's you had asked me, I think last episode, something that maybe it was on or off camera. I can't even remember at this point, but an issue where my views are maybe still changing, and Donald Trump is definitely on that list in the sense of, I mean, I certainly am by no means a fan of everything he says, does, or thinks, but especially post assassination attempt, it is a struggle for me to get a grasp on on any idea of what his genuine motives are for maintaining his, like for being in public life. At least in the political sense. Obviously, he had, been in public life for decades prior to that. But why did he run for president, and why is he seeking the presidency again? Right? I mean, I don't know. That I find that interesting, because I can't get a firm grasp on what, if any, principles he has. It's not clear to me what those are, or whether they're fluid or not, to the degree to which they're fluid, if at all. But particularly after the assassination attempt, that's a pretty harrowing thing to have happen to you, regardless of whatever you view his politics as being. So I'm just curious what you think of that. Like, what are his motives?
Yeah, that's
because he could have gone into obscurity, right?
He could. Well, so I think what makes Donald Trump interesting is that he is the most modern version of the naked pursuit of power that we have. And I think it becomes very confusing for people, because we are steeped in all this like West Wing rhetoric of higher calling, and when you are in public service, there's just nothing more important than serving the public. And I was born in the middle class, and Kamala's like trying to read an Aaron Sorkin script, and you just look at it and you roll your eyes because you've been lied to. And when Donald Trump comes along in 2015 in a debate and says, yeah, I'm rich and it's awesome, and guess what? I paid off all of these people too. That was the moment where we all went, all right, this guy's awesome, right? Even if you kind of like, I never really liked Donald Trump because he's a moral cretin. Like, I just look at him and go, this is I see like Frank Turek and some of these Christian apologists who are trying to transition into politics, and Mark Driscoll. They're like, you can't vote for demonic forces. You got to fight to save the republic by voting for light and truth. And I'm like, that's Donald Trump, the guy that cheated on his wife, his pregnant wife with a porn star. Like, he's so unashamed of his behavior in a culture that feels like it should be ashamed of every decision they make. I heard a comedian, I think it was Jimmy Dore, say, we live in a society that is, that takes after the adult child of an alcoholic. And the adult child of an alcoholic is a codependent person that is a people pleaser who is constantly thinking about how others perceive them and trying to adjust their behavior and thinking to be liked. I don't think it will shock people to find out I'm an ACOA, but it kind of, you lose your moral spine when you grow up with a parental figure that you're always trying to please, judge their behavior, right? So when somebody comes along who does not make an apology for being an absolute moral cretin, and in fact says, this is kind of a good thing, and don't you like me that I'm telling the truth? Mm-hmm. Like he said on the Andrew Schultz podcast this week, essentially I'm a truth teller. And Andrew Schultz just like laughed in his face. He goes, what do you mean? Right? Like, and this is a comedian who's probably going to vote for him, right? But he's voting for him because he doesn't tell the truth. He just wants power because he likes to exercise power. He likes to have power to fill his financial coffers. Donald Trump's basic business model was licensing his name. So he doesn't own like the Trump Tower in Chicago. He licenses his name to put on the Trump Tower. Somebody else owns that building, I think. Mm-hmm. But if you look at like a lot of his property, he doesn't own a lot of the property. Some he does, some he doesn't. But he was a licensing guy. Trump Steaks, Trump University. He didn't run these things. And so when you are licensing your reputation has to be good. So when he runs in 2016 and steps in the arena, he loses half the country, if not more, right? He only ever won 30% in those primaries. So he has put himself in a financial situation, especially with the lawsuits that he has to fight, where he has to continually make money, and people don't want to do business with him in the same way. So he has to come out with the coins, and he has to come out with the Bibles, and the Bibles cost $3, made in China. And then now the Oklahoma legislature, you can only buy the Trump Bible, but you have to put it in your classroom, right? So it's a bit of a grift, and he would lie to you and say that it's not a grift. But I think why Trump is hard to get their head around for people like you and I is that when you look at everything and approach everything from a moral principle, and public action extends out of your private motivations, your private desire to do, promote the welfare of the common good, right? He doesn't care about the common good, right? He will say that he does. So I think of Donald Trump as just like someone who is nakedly pursuing power. And he doesn't lie about it. He's honest about it. He sort of doesn't really know what he believes. He'll say one thing one day, the next thing the next. And it doesn't really matter, right? And he's sort of like a P.T. Barnum. His hero is P.T. Barnum. He's kind of a con man, right? Whereas someone like Hillary Clinton is nakedly pursuing power, but they have built a carefully constructed mask. Yes. I think Kamala Harris is someone that is a lot like this. She hasn't spent decades perfecting her mask, which is why she can't do interviews because it keeps falling off. It lacks Hillary Clinton's ability to. She doesn't have the PR arm, right? Like when you wear a mask, you build like rings around you of self-protection, right? And when you are in public life at the level that Kamala Harris or Donald Trump is, it is incredibly hostile. Like, I heard a study today, like if you want to get to a certain level in a Fortune 500 company, like COO, you are choosing to get divorced. 100% of those people get divorced because you have to be so married to the job to climb up a certain ladder. Like that's part of my conundrum in my, I'm on a network television show. I could go do stand-up comedy. I could go into television. I could go into talk radio. I could do all these things, but that's going to come at a cost of my young family. Right? Yeah. So those things are closed off to me because I made the choice to have kids and get married to Reagan. So, where Donald Trump doesn't have those thoughts. Who's Don Jr.?
I know, but I guess I think of and again, obviously there's a lot of backstory and a lot that's happened prior to the assassination attempt, and it's not necessarily easy for him to just exit the race at that point, but I do think I don't know. I think he's one of those figures where I'm like 50 years from now. And if I was born 50 years from now, and then, I was 12 or 14, 60, 65 years from now, he'd be someone I would be really interested in reading biography of.
Leslie, there's no other American who has had a crazier life story than Donald Trump.
Yeah, it's just wild.
One of his days would be your craziest story. Yeah, so I met Stormy Daniels. My wife was pregnant, but right? Like that would be the craziest thing that had ever happened to you if you're like an accountant working at Arthur and Anderson in 1998, right? Like he's just, I think that's part of it. He's just lived such an extraordinary life at such a high level that we are all completely fascinated by someone who just doesn't care, doesn't seem to have a compass, yet still succeeds. Like he breaks all of the rules that you were taught as a kid. Treat people well. Okay, well, this guy's been sued 8,000 times for fraud, right? Be nice to others. Yet I really look at this guy, right? Like I think I could kill somebody and I get away with it. There's just no rules seem to apply to him, and so it's sort of, I think, a cultural thing where we want to see how far he can take it. I also think, like, why continue after the assassination attempt? There isn't a historical figure that has an assassination attempt and survives it that doesn't turn that into a messianic complex.
True,
I really do truly honestly believe that Donald Trump has wrestled with this, has been processing this to the best of his ability. I think it genuinely, as much as Donald Trump's thought process can turn inward and be disrupted as a narcissistic person, like, has processed this. But I think eventually you just stop giving up that processing and start going with, I guess I'm destined to be president again, right? So I don't know. I take a very cynical view of the man. I don't think that he has really much concern for other people. I don't think he's like Mitch Daniels, who sits there and thinks about the welfare of the people he's serving. He's not like Hillary Clinton, who, yes, I have allies that I need to care for. Like, he doesn't care what happens to Rudy Giuliani or Michael Cohen or any of these people. He just throws them under the bus for his own self-preservation. So I think when you compare him to the way that the Republican Party was, and this is why Republicans and me, and I would say this, Republicans who are not in the party anymore, the never Trumpers, the media, people who've been in politics for a long time. I've watched politics for 35 years, 30 years. I was a Republican, disaffected, went to the Libertarian Party. I don't know how, like, I got into the Republican Party in high school and started working as like a freshman in college for a guy named Todd Rokita, who's now Attorney General, who's real big into Trump, because I was like, look, we need a moral world, and the best way to create, like, it's idolatrous thinking, right? That you think you can create a moral world through politics. We can use government force, put a gun to your head, and make you live the teachings of Jesus. It's completely the opposite of what Christ ever taught. He was all about persuasion and winsomeness and trying to convince you and call you, not to force you to make a decision. But I mean, that's, I thought like a child, right? So, but the whole thing is, like, when we were talking about Francis Schaeffer and Charles Colson, what you have is in the 70s, 60s, 70s, Francis Schaeffer's this guy who lives in Switzerland, who really starts influencing a lot of people through Labrie and through his writings about culture. Because what was happening in the late 60s is you had all of these people traveling Europe looking for the big philosophies. So you had people like Os Guinness, who is connected to the beer company family, goes, spends 3 years there. One of my favorite Christian authors who helps popularize Schaeffer and the Christian worldview idea, The Call. What a tremendous book that is. And Francis Schaeffer kind of says, like, the church is weak. Liberal Christians always give in and compromise. We need cultural reform around Christ's viewpoint. We have to be the rod and the staff. We have to come out and set up these bumpers and say, this is what the God of the universe believes, and we shouldn't be ashamed of it. He then influences Charles Colson and Jerry Falwell. Jerry Falwell goes from this guy who's like anti-politics and starts talking nonstop about politics. James Dobson. There's a documentary on Netflix called The Family. And Leslie, I don't know if you ever watched like a Netflix documentary about Christians. Do you just laugh the whole time going, man, this is awesome. Why are they mad about this?
Guys, I mean, you've seen some like bits and pieces here and there. It's been so long since I've watched a full like Netflix series. So,
but you see the rise of the Republican right, the Christian right, and what's the guy?
Correct me if I'm wrong. Is it one of those kind of series where it's like the stereotypes of Christians are just almost funny to observe,
Yes.
or is it?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
Because
like-
I do, when I see clips, I'm always like, that's hysterical that you think that.
And then Leslie, they got together at a conference. Like, you're like, oh, you mean people who agree with each other on certain ideas got together at a conference and agreed to promote each other and donate to their causes and find rich guys to promote them. What? Like, you're like that's not what George Soros does. Like, this is just how the world works. But there's something where Christians and Republicans, when they do the thing that everybody else does, it becomes this nefarious, dark web of connect. Like, give me a break. And so, but you had the rise of the conservative right come up in the 80s and 90s, and they push in the 80s the idea through the presidential campaign of the 500 Club guy who just passed. What's his name? Oh gosh, I mean, I can. It's not James Dobson. He's the Focus on the Family guy. Who's the old?
Yeah, he was Focused on the Family. Huh?
No, 500 Club. Let me look it up. It's
I'm trying to think of names now.
Yeah, the CBN, the 700 Club is who Pat Robertson.
Yes. Okay.
Right.
Oh gosh.
So Pat Robertson runs an 80 or 84, basically saying we need a moral majority. Like, the country is moral. We're losing. They take Schaefer's idea of like the world is slipping into chaos, into secularism, and we need to fight back and organize to fight back against secular humanism. And they really influence the Republican Party through talk radio. And so what you see through the 90s, through the 2000s, and the 2010s, blossoming into the Tea Party, is this idea of having a Republican Party that is focused on being the, how would you put it, the vanguard of the Christian worldview. Is that a good way to put it?
Like, I think so. Yeah.
We as
at least public facing. Right?
Yeah. Now, of course, you get foot tapping and wide stances and Ted Haggard with young boys and that eventually is what makes it fall. Your plausibility structure falls apart. So you cannot push a Christian worldview if you don't have a plausibility structure. And a plausibility structure is when people look at you, they think you're credible, and so therefore they're willing to trust your ideas and adopt them. And when your plausibility structure starts to fall apart because you have, Newt Gingrich and Bob Barr and Ted Haggard and all these people having affairs, and your plausibility structure falls apart, and an entire generation, of which Leslie and I are dealing with in millennials and Gen Z, don't see the plausibility structure, so the worldview does not hold weight. When pressure is applied to the Christian worldview, it falls apart, because look at these examples. Now, Leslie, we could look at that and say, well, media bias love to just talk about the Jerry Falwell Juniors of the world and make them look foolish. But don't do meth with teen boys. That's on Ted Haggard. That's not on Jesus, right? But I think that is kind of like my history lesson to get us into where we're at now, which is that secular humanist version of Republican views. And like, there's like how would you describe it, Leslie? And I don't know if you see this, but there is definitely like Big Eva, the big evangelical, and the leftover stuff from like the Bush era and the Mike Pences and, Christian conferences. But then there's like a lot of libertarian people who have floated into monarchist views and Orbanism and, they kind of sometimes partner with Catholic integralists who want to create a theonomist world where we're using the force of government. Like, I'm still over here, like, I'm a Christian who believes in pluralism and libertarianism, so I'm not going to force my views on you. I just want to persuade you that they're better. Versus the Republican Party, which is like, that view is naive, and the only way to protect the Christian worldview from being subsumed by a tsunami of secularism is to point the gun back at them, because the gun's going to be pointed at you. Is that a fair summation? Please hop in here and stop me from rambling.
And I think one thing that's really missing are some of the only thing I think is missing from that is sort of the bigger, like, even more macro cultural waters that we swim in that were developed over the 20th century, right? That were highly secular in nature and led to the kind of cultural gatekeeping that the left has on, like they have a stranglehold on things like art, entertainment, education, and to some degree law. And so it's interesting to me because I think it's such a reactionary force in the sense of we don't guard the Christian worldview. The Christian worldview is guarded by God, right? I mean, like it's going to keep going. It was going long before this. It's not going to stop. I don't think it needs us to keep it going in any sense. So I think it's our as Christians, our job is to understand what the worldview is and then live it out to the best of our ability. It's not to kind of guard it in any sense. That doesn't mean though that it has no application in the political realm. So yeah, one of the things I always struggled with on the political side, and one of the reasons I floated towards libertarianism was this idea that I think it is almost a bastardization of the faith to overly politicize it. Like it because that's not the point, right? But on the other hand, I look back and go, on the other hand, it's important to have morality inform law. Like this idea that you can separate law and morality is also not accurate. So the dividing line, I think, regardless of what your ideology or political viewpoints are, is not that morality and law are separate, but when is it appropriate to use law to, enforce certain moral beliefs, and when is it not appropriate? I think that's really where the dividing line
and I
is.
think that's like Christianity informs my politics. It always has, but that's why while I'm pro-life because of my view on life and the Imago Dei, that also makes me pro-immigration and anti-kids in cages, right? Like, so there's like two instances where my worldview and importance on the value, dignity, and liberty of a human life, regardless of their nationality, puts me at odds with Trump, but also puts me in agreement with Trump, maybe. We'll talk about the platform in a second.
Sure, but I do think it's like having that broader perspective at least helps me frame the issue of these reactionary forces on the right aren't necessarily reacting to a broader cultural trend that they feel powerless against. And I think that that's often kind of left out of the analysis, particularly when the critique of the right is coming from a more secular humanist standpoint, right? Is that, hey, look at these, they're kind of always been the same. They've always been hypocrites, so on and so forth. And to some degree that's true, but those movements are reacting to genuine problems that they see, right? And they may have misguided ways of dealing with that, but that helps me to sort of frame the issue of what are the actual dominant moral philosophies coming from.
So let me give you an example. We'll give you an example to see like if I understand you correctly. So let's take the issue of family disintegration, right? So we pass no fault divorce, which means I'm divorced, right? My wife and I, I'm not going to get into why we got divorced, but we did, right? You would have had to have shown in 50 to 75 years ago, somebody cheated, there's irreconcilable, that you would have to go to the state and beg them to release you from your marriage, which just kept people married. And the Catholic integralist argument would be that forced people to make their marriage better because they didn't have a choice. I don't know that I totally buy that. I'm sure it's all over the place in terms of how the trade-offs worked. But so you get rid of no-fault divorce, which leads to, the disintegration of the nuclear family. It leads to a lot of issues between kids and parents, and that leads to self-esteem issues with kids. That leads to higher rates of crime and all these different, right? So fathers are no longer as engaged with their kids. And so, and I would look at it and go, I agree with the analysis, but bringing back no-fault divorce isn't necessarily going to fix that, right? And that may not be the total cause of why all those other things happen. You can look at birth control, women's empowerment.
Yeah.
Not saying that's a bad thing, right? Like, I'm just saying, like, there are a lot of different cultural forces that have led to family disintegration. And one of them is just the idea of the nuclear family to begin with, right? Which I'm not going to like go to bat for. I'm going to say like my wife's family of where we all get together, there's 25 of us and support each other and have extended family around is way better than me and my wife and our 2 kids trying to go it alone. Right? Like, so I think there's like a bit of a cherry picking of some of these things and saying, well, this is the cause of X. And so therefore we need to force people back into these ideas. Is that an example of like a cultural force that you're talking about that has led to, because men are on the downslope in a lot of areas, fathers are not a part of their lives, men are getting left or not finding dates for many different reasons, that has led to a reaction. It's a perfectly normal reaction to those cultural forces.
Yes, I think that is an example, and I think it's important to think about the relationship between law and culture, right? Like, I feel like it's almost a chicken and egg question of which comes first. So, for example, Roe v. Wade. I think because abortion was sort of decided originally as by the Supreme Court, right? It's a constitutional right. We have this right. We've had it for quote unquote 50 years. So when it's overturned, I think the way it was culturally absorbed by people who are maybe more moderately pro-choice or really kind of on the fence was as if it was more cataclysmic than necessary, right? Because you're thinking about it from the standpoint of, this right has been, why they're taking away rights. It's an easy framing of the issue when the law has decided the cultural issue for that long. Obviously, that's very different than no-fault divorce, but I do think that it would have been easier for the pro-life movement to make more cultural inroads on the issue of abortion if it hadn't been arbitrarily defined as a constitutional right for 50 years, and therefore policy couldn't move very far in the pro-life direction, right? So that's kind of a counterexample of how I think that because of the way the law was written, it made it much, much more difficult to do a lot of cultural work on that specific issue. But on the flip side of that, you can't force a culture that thinks something like, say, no-fault divorce is the way to go. You can't really force people through law to have different beliefs about how they should live. Like that, it doesn't really work that way, right? So if someone, for instance, thinks that, let's just take an extreme example, if you were to have like a chastity law, you're not supposed to have sex until you're married, and you're going to try to enforce that. Well, if your culture just thinks that they should be able to have sex before marriage, and is going to live that out, you're going to have a really difficult time, through law changing the way the culture views that issue. The example of that would be like prohibition, right? I mean, how effective was prohibition? Right. So, I mean, like, you have to have cultural buy-in for certain laws to work, I guess is what I'm saying, right? If you don't, it's going to be virtually impossible to enforce them. But that doesn't mean, I don't think, that the way in which you handle law doesn't affect how people view the morality of action, because it does, right? I mean, people view things that are illegal more or less as more wrong, right? You can slander someone by saying that they did something illegal. The reason for that is that they're going to associate the illegal act as something that they shouldn't have done, and there's going to be a kind of moral undertone there.
I mean, COVID. Remember when they, all of a sudden everybody's closing down the NCAA and the NBA, and everybody's all in it together, but then the second government starts getting involved, people are like, well, now we need to riot on the governor's lawn, right? And I think your Roe example is a great example. Like, and I think Ruth Bader Ginsburg has kind of made a similar point. You have the country liberalizing in a lot of ways, or at least having a discussion about abortion and bringing it out of the shadows and then debating it in a way that a Democratic Republic is supposed to via state levels. You have New York and other places starting to liberalize their law, and other places are not, but there is a wrestling with the topic that is happening back and forth in 50 different states. And then all of a sudden you put an ideological tariff of 100% on abortion by passing Roe and forcing every state to abide by a law, which then creates this reactionary force that's what motivates Francis Schaeffer. That's what motivates Francis Schaeffer then to disciple and, inspire James Dobson, Jerry Falwell, Charles Colson, like the villains, if you're a progressive humanist, like the villains of the Christian right. Like it was the Roe versus Wade decision that did that. It was, it's not like they woke up one day, if you're sitting here listening as a progressive going, I want to be evil, right? Like there was a cultural change that caused their reaction, right? So let's dive into what has changed in the Republican platform. Okay, so I think we've set the stage here for, the conversation around the platform. And so there's a lot of conversation, Leslie, around Donald Trump changing the Republican Party platform, or at least Trump acolytes changing various different shifts from old language that has been there for decades. Let's actually listen.
Not only the president and my ongoing difference.
Sorry. Let's listen to Mike Pence give his reaction to this platform. And I think as the old guard, it sets up a lot of what we've heard. And then we'll hear from Eric Trump.
When the president announced last spring that abortion was now simply a state issue, I said in an editorial in a major newspaper that I wanted to see the president reclaim his passion for life, the passion that we had in our administration. But with regard to my position, I'm staying out of this race. I ran for president.
All right, we're not going to get into all the Mike Pence gobbledygook. As a Hoosier, I'm familiar with it. Nice man, but ugh. All right.
Republican platform.
So let's get to Eric Trump being interviewed on NBC at the RNC about this platform issue.
The Republican platform, interestingly, has moved to the center on a couple of key issues. For the first time in 40 years, the Republican platform does not call for a federal abortion ban. It no longer defines marriage as between one man and one woman, but it doesn't. So is this a sign that your father is moving to the center in some ways or on some issues?
I think he's always been there on those issues, to tell you the truth. And I think that's reflective of who my father is and what he believes in. And I think that's reflective of my wife, Laura, who runs the RNC, and clearly what she believes in. And I'm proud of the party. I mean, listen, at the end of the day, this country has real holes in the roof, and you've got to fix those holes, and you've got to stop worrying about the little, spot on the wall in the basement. You've got to fix those holes, and we've got real immigration problems.
All right, so I find this interesting because what they changed, let me pull this up. There's holes in the wall, Leslie. Abortion needs to be liberalized, and we need to get down to deporting immigrants. That's the important stuff, right? So it's interesting what they choose to emphasize. So on abortion, the actual change in the language in 2016, this was a long time standing plank in the platform. You don't know what a platform is? Every convention, delegates are elected from across the country in various localities to come and participate as representatives of the party in platform discussions. So like the Libertarian Party platform in the 70s had like, when we land on the moon, we will institute these things, right? And then they simplified that down. Let's talk about things people care about, right? So it's our party's take, a snapshot of our party's beliefs on an issue in this time period. And so in 2016, it said, we assert the sanctity of human life and affirm that the unborn child has a fundamental right to life, which cannot be infringed. Over a dozen states have passed legislation prohibiting abortion after 20 weeks, and we call on Congress to enact the federal version. Mike Pence believes in a federal version of the abortion law. The 2024 platform says Republicans will protect and defend a vote of the people from within the states on the issue of life. After 51 years, because of us, that power has been given to the states and a vote of the people. We will oppose late-term abortion while supporting mothers and policies that advance prenatal care, access to birth control, and IVF treatments. So I think that's an interesting shift. You may know more about this. I mean, I'm not like some scholar on abortion policy or any of that kind of, but like to me, I find it interesting, this argument over federal ban versus states, because I'd always heard Republicans talk about like, we need to get rid of Roe so the states can decide. And now both sides are arguing over a federal ban again. Like, what is that a new thing, or did I just miss the conversation?
I don't think it is. I mean, there's obviously, if you want to go higher into the more philosophical or legal arguments, there's arguments of across, different arguments you could make, at least that I'm familiar with, relating to some people would like to see a like constitutional right to life, so there's that kind of version of the equality. Equal protection would mean that there's an equal, there's some kind of constitutional protection for the unborn. Clearly, that's not anything the Supreme Court hinted at in the Dobbs decision of granting personhood, for example, to unborn children. But I think as far as it relates to the federal issue, I wonder if that comes down to maybe the libertarian leanings of different, of those who are pro-life. Because I mean, the issue of life itself doesn't necessarily dictate where someone lands on, is it appropriate to do a federal ban or not? Or should you just try to persuade people in your state? I honestly don't have myself. I can see arguments on both sides of those issues.
So let me, my distraction aside, what do you make of that? I guess I'm not surprised that a guy who was a Democrat 12 years ago when Eric Trump says he's always been this guy, I guess you believe him, right? But the Republican Party, which is made up of a lot of boomers in cowboy hats with red, white, and blue sparklies on their head. I'm kind of surprised they go along with this and they're not more hardcore on it. Is that a cult effect where Donald Trump says this, so we're going to do this, or what?
Yes. Well, actually, I think it's just a cultural trend, and it's actually something that concerns me from a long-term perspective. Now, zoom back, imagine we're 50 years down the road. So I think what's interesting right now, from what I can tell from the Republican Party, is we do not have the Republican Party that I grew up with and the sort of conservative movement and conservative culture in a way. I don't think we have that anymore. I mean, if you look at the platform of the Republican Party, particularly again on these moral foundational issues that in some ways defined what it was to be on the right side of the aisle, and I think is the reason there's still a stereotype culturally that if you're conservative, you're Christian. I mean, conservative now means you're not hard left. That's right. Essentially what the word conservative means, right? You might get canceled on a college campus. Well, that by no stretch of the imagination means you're conservative.
Yeah, that's kind of, you're hitting on something there. Sorry to keep interrupting.
Yeah,
but it's
no,
just,
you're good. You're good.
Radio thing, and I'm a man, you're a woman, and I have to talk. It's just how it is. No, so the rally for the Republic thing that just happened, where Jimmy Dore and Russell Brand and Jordan Peterson and Tucker Carlson and Vivek Ramaswamy all get together, and Donald Trump, I guess, is in that coalition, and that apparently is conservative now. And if you picked apart Jimmy Dore's beliefs as of a year ago, or Russell Brand, you wouldn't say that's conservative, but they have this weird version of moralism. I guess Dave Smith, I'll invoke his and he can send his bots after me, but Dave Smith's not a Christian. I wouldn't consider him of the Christian right in any way, obviously, and that's not a slam. It's obvious, but he comes from a place of morality, but it feels like that morality is rooted in something secular as opposed to something religious. I know he's of the Jewish faith, or maybe he's not practicing, I don't know. But Vivek and Russell Brand, I know he's super into Jesus now, but Jimmy Dore, all these people come at things from a moral perspective, and they're conservative, but I don't really know what they're conserving. What is Tucker Carlson conserving? And maybe that's the question that you're asking, right? What makes Donald Trump a conservative?
It seems to me that they're conserving. What's a good way to phrase it? Because it seems to me that they're conserving what they perceive to be the America that existed prior to the Overton window shifting so far left. And by Overton window, to be clear, I don't mean necessarily that the public agrees with that, but in order to be in certain circles of society that are higher on the socioeconomic, brackets, if you were to be more well educated, for example, you kind of have to buy into a certain very hard left worldview. and beliefs about what society should look like, how it should be organized, what is and isn't moral. And so I think that they're more conserving this image that they have of the U.S. and of the West, that it's almost like, think of it as there's the conservative, philosophy. I don't think that's what they're really focusing on. They're focusing on a way of life, it almost seems like, right? Like, which is why it starts to coalesce around really foundational issues like freedom of speech, things that are, I mean, frankly, very foundational. I mean, I'm not thrilled with threats to freedom of speech either. But when you look at the personalities and the individual and the philosophies displayed and promoted by those on the right and the Republican Party, I mean, even if you look at those who were on stage at the RNC, this is not the party of 30, 35 years ago.
Yeah.
Those individuals would be nowhere near the Republican Party.
And I don't know that you and I think that's good or bad. It's an observation.
My concern comes into play when it comes to what happens in 50 years, in the sense of, I think the rise, when people talk about, the new right, and they kind of make the new right and religious people who are more conservative into the boogeyman, I'm concerned in the sense that there's usually a big pendulum swing, right? And if the Republican Party is now espousing beliefs that were once more or less mainstream in the Democratic Party, which I think is where we're at, we essentially have a hard left party and a moderate left party from a moral perspective. And I am interested in seeing what that means long term, because I'm concerned that that shift isn't necessarily organic at the level of the public. I think there was a lot of media messaging and campaigning that went into shifting the Overton window to the left. That was, again, I'm not saying no public opinion shifted in that direction. I mean, the left more or less won the culture wars, but it's not as if those culture wars weren't won without a lot of fingers on the scale as it relates to media, particularly. Think about how the left won the culture wars before social media and the internet took off, right? Yeah. And now you have ecosystems of communication that facilitate a lot more viewpoints. And anyway, long story short, I'm concerned that there can be pendulum swings that go way too far the opposite direction. And I think that some of the more extreme rhetoric you're hearing on the right is evidence of that.
What's the Malice quote? A conservative is just a liberal from 50 years ago, or they fight to conserve what the progressives thought 30 years ago. I forget what the quote is, but it's something along those lines. Yeah, I almost see this so let's look at just some of these other examples of that. Maybe that can kind of give us a little bit more of a clue. I can buy your premise. Okay. I think, let's look at immigration. Our highest priority must be to secure our borders and all ports of entry and to enforce our immigration laws. That is why we support building a wall on our southern border and protecting all ports of entry. 2024, begin the largest deportation program in American history. We will complete the border wall, shift massive portions of federal law enforcement to immigration enforcement, and use advanced technology to monitor and secure the border. We will use all resources needed to stop the invasion and move thousands of troops currently stationed overseas to our southern border. Quite the shift there. Education, 2016. Centralizing forces from outside the family and community have sought to remake education in order to remake America. 2024. Knowledge and skills, not CRT and gender indoctrination. We're going to close the Department of Education in D.C. and send it back to the states where it belongs. Economy, 2016. We impose firm caps on future debt, accelerate the repayment of trillions we now owe in order to reaffirm our principles of responsible and limited government and remove the burdens we are placing on future generations. 2024, our America First economic agenda rests on 5 pillars: slashing regulations, cutting taxes, securing fair trade deals, ensuring reliable and abundant low-cost energy, and championing innovation. Also, weird capitalization here, like Donald Trump's writing it himself. Last one, LGBTQ rights, 2016. Traditional marriage and family based on the marriage between one man and one woman is the foundation for a free society. They are determined to reshape our schools and our entire society to fit the mold of an ideology alien to America's history and traditions. Their edict to the states concerning restrooms, locker rooms, and other facilities is at once illegal, dangerous, and ignores privacy issues. 2024, Republicans will end left-wing gender insanity. We will keep men out of women's sports, ban taxpayer funding for sex change surgeries, and stop taxpayer-funded schools from promoting gender transition, reverse Biden's radical rewrite of Title IX education regulations, and restore protections for women and girls. My read on a lot of this is a lot of, like, the abortion change, for instance, the LGBT one with fighting gender insanity, quote unquote. Like, that's kind of popular. Like 60% of the country believes in that, right? Republicans keep getting their butt kicked at the polls on abortion. People generally like the idea of a secure border. I don't think they're going to like the idea of mass deportations, though, but they like the idea. They think that he takes it seriously and she doesn't. They want fair deal, fair trades, and, you know, if whatever's going to get me a better economy, then I'll do it. Right? Instead of looking at it like a limited government, Paul Ryan, here's a technocratic view of how we're going to limit Mitch Daniels, we need to get deficit spending under control. Mm-hmm. Right. Very like policy focused, technocratic, reduce these things, change these things. We're going to focus on this. This feels much more populist in that what is popular, we're going to market to you, and less principled, where the Ed Meese Heritage Foundation is writing books on the Constitution and how to achieve a limited government according to the Constitution. The Heritage Foundation under Kevin Robertson is like, here's Project 2025, and we're going to promote these things that are popular. And like, I think you mentioned coalition building. Like, that really sort of feels like, all right, if you're generally within this worldview of trans people bad, immigrants bad, economy good, you know, abortion, we're going to declare a truce, which is the Libertarian Party way, by the way. The Libertarian Party had a settled truce from 72 on. Like, we're not going to push pro-choice or pro-life. We're just going to ignore that issue, and we're going to coalition around a lot of other ideas. Yeah. And not fight about that, and I'll vote for you if you vote for me, right? That sort of is what that feels like to me. It's not it's not conservative because it's not conserving anything. It is giving people what they think they want.
It is, and I think it's indicative of a broader political trend, frankly, to some degree on both the right and the left, that's much more interested in it's almost like too focused on the practical, right? On the here and now. There's not a long view of politics or culture building right now seems really rare, frankly, on both sides to some degree. I think the left has the benefit of having done the long march through the institutions, right? Where I think conservatives were more asleep at the wheel. Because again, of course, if you go back further in time, conservative traditions and values were more of what constituted the shared consensus, right? So the long march through institutions is maybe harder to detect, or it's easy to go, oh, well, things don't look too bad right now, you know, kind of ignore what's happening. But yeah, I think that there's a really short view of politics right now. And that seems to come from, I think it's both because we've been governing ourselves very poorly for a very long time. So we have a lot of issues, frankly, that are becoming more dire because of a lack of, you know, no one had the intestinal fortitude to deal with the issues at the time that it would have been ideal to deal with them. So now they're significantly more advanced than they otherwise would have been, right? Kind of like preventative medicine. Now you have cancer because you refused to do what you needed to ensure that wasn't a likely outcome. So I think that's some of what's going on. So yeah, and it just seems to be, and you're right that it's very populist, and it's rhetoric, and even the way it's phrased is very populist. And it's very, in some ways, what fascinates me with the platform is it's somewhat, and in some ways, brilliantly written from a like marketing standpoint. If you were to be taking the way it's written is so direct, very clear as to what the agenda is, which is very Trumpian in style, but I think is one of his strengths, right? Is that he's able to say things in this very direct, no fluff way, removes all of the more verbose language that
the compromised language of like
those documents.
Bureaucratic Republicans of the past. Let's make this soft because we don't want the media to be mean to us. Versus, in 2016 he had to kind of deal because he didn't have the party. Well, now he's got the party. He's fully in command of the party, and he can write things the way he wants. I'm not under the illusion that he really read this, but I think it reflects the way that he thinks about things and what he emphasizes. Like the abortion plank is kind of wishy-washy, but we're going to mass deportation. Like, what does that mean? Does that mean that my friend, Alina, who's been on this podcast, who's a naturalized citizen, they magically make up like her naturalized paperwork, like has a mistake on it. So she's going back to Colombia, even though she's lived here her whole life. Or does that mean that the violent, illegal criminal who's murdered 3 people gets shipped back and we're going to break, right? It's not very clear. And I think that's kind of on purpose. And so, I think your point is really well taken of what's foundational here. And is there a political party now that has any kind of mooring, not even just to like the Christian worldview? I think the answer is probably no. The Republican Party doesn't represent the Christian worldview. Maybe a Christian nationalist worldview, but I view Christian nationalism as like a perversion of like an idolatrous politics has infiltrated the left and right. Like politics has controlled these churches on the left and the right, as opposed to letting Christ inform your politics. And they're unmoored from the Christian worldview, but even then, like, they're not moored to a worldview, right? It is almost a secular worldview on the Republican plank here. Is like, well, whatever feels good now, we're going to do it. Whatever gets us elected now, we're going to do it. And maybe we're romanticizing the platform from 30 years ago. Leslie, I don't know. Maybe there were charlatans then too, but
I think some of it's driven by raw, like, desire for power. That's always the case. That always creeps into any time. No matter what time period you're in, power and politics always, mingle. But I think there is also a genuine interest among some on both sides to solve certain issues. And again, those issues are very advanced because as a country, I think we've just lived in luxury and not seen and allowed a lot of public policy issues to go unaddressed for a very long time. Yeah. Let's just put it that way, that are both issues of policy and issues of culture. And we've just sort of been asleep at the wheel. And that's creating a lot of problems for us now. I would say that this document also less reflects even anything akin to Christian nationalism. I mean, I think one of the reasons Christians pander to the Republican Party is because they perceive it as the only place they have a voice at the table. And when you think that you either have no voice at the table or you have some influence here, it's really easy to justify, and overlook a lot of flaws from the whatever side it is that's allowing you to sit at the table and feel like you have a voice.
All right, well, we got to end there because we're out of time, and I can hear Keith screaming in the background, and we got to wrap up. So
he's doing his best.
I know. I heard him cry before I asked that last question. I was like, this got to be the last question. Little man's hungry. All right, so just give a final thought, or and plug your book, please.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so I have a poetry collection, Silent Suffering, Poems of Pain and Purpose. It takes philosophy, history, and theology and weaves it into a collection of analytic poems. So poems that focus more on philosophy and like how you think rather than the 5 senses. It's available via Amazon. I think it's a pretty neat collection. And it was one of my first contribution, hopefully of many, to the something that's more artistic, that's related to, conservative thought, right? I think that there's a dearth of that kind of combination of the emotive and analytic. And then I'm also working on another book that I'll hopefully be publishing next year. So more on that later.
All right. It's not called More on That Later, but that'd be kind of a funny title. All right. Thanks, Leslie. It's been great talking to you, and I look forward to maybe we can get together here in a couple weeks and continue the conversation. We've got a few different ideas sketched out, and we'd love to hear from you. You can send me an email, chris@chrisspangle.com, with your thoughts on these 2 episodes, and I'll share that with Leslie. If you have questions or thoughts, or you want to poke holes at maybe something we've said, then write in and we'll respond to it here on the show. That'd be super fun, and we want to have a conversation with you. So that's it's always fun to have conversation with more than just us. We want to hear, we are right, Leslie. Obviously, we know everything. But if you want to try, go ahead. All right. Thanks so much for joining us here on the Chris Spangle Show, and we will see you again soon.